Okay, good afternoon, students. Welcome back to our class. I think I'll just begin with a few questions, okay? Number one, okay? Give me an answer. You can send in your answers in the chat box. What, according to you, is the best form of government? What, according to you, is the best form of government? You can have options like a monarchical government, an aristocratic government, a meritocratic government, a democratic government, an oligarchic government. These are all different kinds of governments that you have in various parts of the world. Okay, I find an overwhelming majority of answers in favor of democracy, the rule of the people. Isn't that so? Where does this concept of democracy come from? We are familiar with somebody's famous definition of democracy as the government for the people, of the people, and by the people. But that is only somebody explaining the concept of democracy. We know that it comes from much earlier times. In fact, the very word is rooted in two foreign words, which means the rule of the people. Yes, I get the answer. There are some who are adding the name of Greece in the chat box. Okay, that is one question. The next question, okay? Now imagine yourself in a situation where you need to make a choice, okay? But it's a very difficult choice because both situations are equally bad. This is an imaginary situation. Let us hope that none of you will ever find yourself in this kind of a situation. But how would you describe that situation when you reach a point of time where you have to make a choice, but on either side you only have trouble, and whatever choice you make, it's not likely to end in happiness for you? What would you describe such a situation as? Think of an idiomatic expression that is normally used. Ah, yes, Arunima has got it right. In between the devil and the sea. Between the devil and the deep sea. That is one way of expressing that kind of situation. Either way you go, you are in trouble. Okay? Now, another question. This takes you back to your informatics class. I don't know how many of you are happy to be reminded of your informatics, but in any case, let me ask you a question based on something that is of great relevance to us, okay, as people who use informatics. Okay, so what is it? What is the term that you use for a malware that looks fine and safe, but comes embedded with a lot of harmful programs, viruses and harmful programs that can make your system crash? What is that kind of a malware known as? A bad software, a bad program. No answers? No one? You've forgotten your informatics. You have an exam coming up where you have to write a whole paper. Isn't it called a Trojan horse? Okay. I hope you recall the use of that term, the Trojan horse. Okay, some of you might be familiar with cricket. I guess most of you do watch cricket matches. Taking you back a few years taking you a few years back, uh, you had India's master blaster Sachin Tendulkar. Now, for all his brilliance, there were a lot of problems that often nagged him in the form of physical injuries, and very often his elbow was considered as his dash. As what? It's a vulnerable part for him. It was something that would often get injured, that tennis elbow, and it gave him a lot of trouble. So, what was that unfortunate, vulnerable point in an otherwise super player known as, yes, Arunima again, Achilles heel? Devika has also answered right. Okay, so I have asked you some four or five questions. Is there any pattern that you can draw between all these? Can you join the dots? What is the connect? The answers that you have given can be linked with one common name. What is that? Not exactly, Gayatri, not exactly Aristotle. You need to go a few centuries before Aristotle. Yes, Arunima has cracked it again. It is indeed Homer. Yes, because these expressions, whether it is a Trojan horse or Achilles heel or between the devil and the deep sea, these are all expressions that have been imprinted on our mind because of Homer's immortal works. Homer, who takes us to the ancient Greek civilization, from which again has come most of the concepts that inform the world today, including the concept of democracy. The world owes much to ancient Greece for its culture, for its literature, for its institutions, for its values, for a lot of reasons, in fact. A lot of our modern life, particularly the life of the Western world, Europe and America and so on, can be seen rooted in Greek culture and civilization. In other words, it was in various ways the cradle of the current Western civilization. That does not, of course, mean that Greek civilization was the earliest. We know that it was not. There were earlier civilizations. But from Greece, there is a famous expression which goes from Plato to NATO. NATO is the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, a very powerful organization involving the best of Europe and North America. And then from Plato to NATO, that immense stretch of history of civilization, which began in ancient Greece and which continues to wield a powerful influence in the Western world. That is what is encapsulated in that phrase, from Plato to NATO. So I would like to take you to ancient Greece, and particularly the work of Homer, as we enter this paper called World Classics in Translation. Okay, so we have three works to discuss there, World Classics in Translation. The three works are in fact ones that deal with the ancient world. You have in that syllabus topics ranging from the ancient world, or texts ranging from the ancient world, from probably the medieval ages and modern times too, various classics in different languages of the world. And our task is to look at some of the classics of Greek and the Greek and Roman civilizations. Okay, so let me make the presentation for you. Yeah, so welcome to the world of world classics, and we will be discussing the work of Homer, the epics, the Iliad, the Odyssey, and the Roman epic of Virgil, the Aeneid. Okay, so these are the three works that we will be discussing. So we'll begin with ancient Greece in order to get introduced to the works of Homer, the Iliad and the Odyssey. We will now go to Greece and look at the Aeneid and Roman civilization afterwards, because the Roman civilization, which is represented in the Aeneid, is nothing but a continuation of the Greek civilization. The glory that was Greece and the grandeur that was Rome. That is a common way of looking at the brilliance of these two civilizations. And the Roman civilization that flourished soon after the decline of the Greek civilization, in many ways bore the stamp and the influence of the Greek civilization. It was during the Hellenistic period, the influence, strong influence of Greece, that Roman civilization reached its peak. So we will look at that through the work, the Aeneid, the epic written by Virgil, the Roman poet. But before that, it is only right that we begin with Greece. Okay? And we are familiar with the classical or the golden age of Greek civilization, which it is believed stretched from the 5th century to around the middle of the 3rd century BC. So that would be somewhere around 500 to 336 BC. It is generally dated as, beginning from the Persian Wars at the beginning of the 5th century, and then with the death of Alexander the Great in 323 BC, you encounter the decline of the Greek civilization, and then it is the Roman way of life which takes over. Now, this period was a period of great war and conflict and so on. In spite of that, in spite of all the tumble and the chaos created by these wars and conflicts, especially between the Greeks and the Persians first, and then between the different city-states of Greece. You have the Athenians and the Spartans, both mighty city-states, and they often got into conflict with each other. But in spite of that, or beyond these conflicts, this was an age of unprecedented heights. Great political and cultural achievements were achieved by Greece during this period. In every field, whether it is science, whether it is history, whether it is the arts, whether it is literature, any field, you have the Grecians reaching eminence, positions of great eminence. You can think of the structure, the image of which I have put up there, the Parthenon. It is the temple dedicated to goddess Athena by the Athenians. Today, of course, it is in the shape, more or less in ruins, but still a marvel of ancient architecture. The way the pillars have been erected, the perfect order that characterizes this kind of a building, which went into ruins only because of natural causes and not otherwise. This is something that spells out for us the brilliance of ancient Greek, not just architecture, but engineering and their general way of life. In the field of history, you have the great historian Herodotus. In medicine, you have Hippocrates, rising to eminence during this time. In the sciences, in mathematics, you have Pythagoras. In the field of literature, of course, this was the great age of the playwrights of the tragic plays like Aeschylus, Sophocles, Euripides, and then the comic playwright Aristophanes, the one who wrote comedies, and also the great philosopher Socrates. These were, figures in different fields who added so much of glory and eminence to that age known as the classical or the golden age of Greek civilization. And it was during this time that the concept of democracy, what can probably be considered as the most enduring contribution of ancient Greece to the modern world, democratia, or the rule by the people. Now, while we linger in this age and marvel at the glory that was Greece, how can we bring in Homer here? Homer, who belonged actually to a much older period. He was probably born during the 8th century, somewhere around that time. We do not have any specific proof regarding his exact year of birth, but it is generally believed that he lived in Greece, ancient Greece, during somewhere around the 8th century. It is much after that, you come back, you have to go ahead 3 centuries, at least 3 centuries, to reach that age which we know as the Golden Age. But what Homer left during his time can definitely be seen to have um, cast a very strong spell on what later became the Golden Age of Greek culture and civilization. That which, the Greek way of life, the Greek attitude towards life, the Greek sense of beauty, order, civilization, all that is encapsulated and presented in Homer's great works like the Iliad and the Odyssey, were actually what the later Grecians of the Golden Age built themselves upon. That Greek culture, which is the most refined expression of the Greek view of their gods as men and of their men as partaking of the divine. This kind of seeing the human beings as mighty gods and seeing the gods as bearing human features. This was a distinct feature of the Greek culture of the Golden Age. But the entry point towards that kind of vision, towards that kind of conceptualization, probably came from Homer, or what Homer left through the many oral works that he popularized. Okay, so they gave up on the animal world, they gave up on the supernatural, and began, combining humanity and divinity. In other words, humanizing the divine. And this again, that which we remember the Greeks more than anything else for now, that again probably was made most popular through the works of Homer. The idealization of the human figure, the result of the value placed on what is known as the ideal image. We have heard a lot about Plato's concept of the Republic, Plato's concept. Of course, Plato was the great student of Socrates, and from Socrates, he gained these ideas regarding the ideal, which of course he held up to great value. And this idea, this era was one that was refined by logic, pattern, order, and a faith in humanism. And that is seen reflected in all their works, in the architectural splendors, in the literary works of those times, and in the system of governance that they developed for themselves. So these are the attributes that are today associated with the art, the culture, and even the politics of that era. And the debt that kind of culture owes to this man, Homer, who lived around 800 to 700 BC. That is what we need to look at. And that is how he finds a very prominent place with two of his works prescribed in your paper on world classics in translation. I do not think any other author has that distinction. A person who can claim to have single-handedly influenced the whole of Western civilization. What have been enshrined in his works, what have been depicted in such colorful ways in his major works, have really influenced the following centuries. So he's one of the most influential authors in every sense, and two of these epics provided the basis of Greek education and culture. What Greece became during the classical age was probably learned from what was left by Homer. He can be considered to have formed the backbone of humanistic or humane education down to the time of the Roman Empire and the spread of Christianity. That is the kind of impact that the Iliad and the Odyssey had on classical Greece. So the Greeks regarded these great epics, the Iliad and the Odyssey, as something more than mere works of literature. There were literary works, but beyond that, which they had memorized, these works which they had memorized, they valued them as a great symbol of that Greek concept of unity, the Greek concept of heroism, and for everything they sought practical instruction as provided in these epics. So it was an ancient source of moral and practical instruction. But who is this Homer? That is a big question. In fact, there is a great deal of uncertainty surrounding Homer. Many other people who believe that a single person could not have achieved the kind of greatness that he achieved, or could not have accomplished the task of writing these entire epics, huge epics like the Iliad and the Odyssey, which is why many critics and historians believe that Homer must have been actually the title that was given to anyone who was an eminent poet and a scholar and a philosopher, and who was entrusted or who took up the responsibility of contributing to these epics. That is one theory regarding Homer. Beyond that, where he was born, when he was born, which language he spoke, whether he was blind, as is generally believed he was. There's a lot of uncertainty regarding Homer, and that is what is known as the Homeric question, a very important question with, when you discuss the classical works of classical literature, you just cannot overlook this point regarding the Homeric question. Probably today considered as one of the greatest of all epic poets, and he composed, it is not written down. The songs were popularized orally, and his disciples transmitted them to the next generation and the generation after that. It was only much later that these were written down, probably during the Roman civilization, many centuries later, that they were written down. Till then, they existed only in the form of oral songs, oral epics, the Iliad and the Odyssey. Many more works were attributed to Homer during his own lifetime, and the other poet of those times, Hesiod, about whom again we do not know much. These two writers, both Homer and Hesiod, and their works become a kind of great source of information about the Greeks, their way of life, the gods that they worshipped, and so on. And the way the Homer's works have survived, that is why so much of importance is given to him as somebody who gave the Western culture its predominant stamp. So, yeah, in every field, whether it is Greek sculpture, Greek pottery, Greek tragedy, you cannot but see the impact of Homer and the stories that he popularized through his songs. And it did not end with Greek culture and civilization. The Romans, who looked up to the Greeks for inspiration, again continued the legacy of Homer and his works through their own works. And beyond that, even today, sitting in this 21st century, we are discussing the work of Homer. So I don't think we need to highlight further the significance of Homer. But when we begin a study of Homer, I think it's only right that we begin with this question known as the Homeric question. Nothing but the debate surrounding the identity of the poet or the poets of the Iliad and the Odyssey. Was it one man or many people who came to occupy the title Homer? There is no, solid proof to settle this matter. You have a lot of conjectures. You have a lot of, sources from which you can derive some kind of proof, but no solid and final proof. So the early Greeks insisted that there was a single individual named Homer, who they considered as the author of the Iliad and the Odyssey, and also many other works like the Homeric hymns. But around the 3rd century, there were many people who came up with this concept known as the Homeric questions. Many of the grammarians, especially looking into the language and the length of these two works, they said that they could have been composed by different writers, particularly the difference in style between the Iliad and the Odyssey. The Iliad is an action-packed epic. You have a war as the central event in the Iliad, and that long war, the 10-year Trojan, 10-year-long Trojan War is what the Iliad is all about. Whereas the Odyssey is written in a more in a different mold altogether. It is not so, even though there is action, you have more of a reflecting style, you have a gentler pace, you have a journey which is described in a way that is different from the way in which war is described in the earlier epics. So because of the different style, because of the different modes in which these two epics were written, many people believe that it definitely was not the work of one person. These two epics must have been written by different people, and many also believe that Homer was a kind of title, that was given to a group of writers who must, at various points of time, have contributed to the composition of the Iliad and the Odyssey. In any case, what you know about him is, this is some of the surviving sculptures have envisioned him in this. This is the image that we have of Homer. The eyes convey the idea that he was a blind bard. The poet of the Iliad and the Odyssey was these two, yeah, it's the same Homeric question that I've described in this slide. We also need to, there was a group of people who believed that, unlike what some of these historians and critics said, Homer definitely was one person, and they claimed to be the what shall you say, the future generations. They claim to be the descendants of Homer, and they call themselves the Homeridae. In the Asia Minor region, you have the Homeridae, who consider themselves to be the direct descendants of Homer. And today, scholars have put all these works, ideas, and conjectures together to formulate whatever we know about Homer. And that is, we believe that he resided in some part of Eastern Greece or maybe Asia Minor. And probably he was born in that region known as Ionia because of the kind of language that is largely found in the oral versions, which later got written down. The dialect that he mainly used probably was Ionic, the dialect of Ionia. And it was also mixed with a little bit of Aeolic. So this was from in the Greek island of Chios, probably. He could have come from there as well. That is another guesswork. And we really do not know how he became blind, but in some of his own works, in some of the songs of the Iliad, in some of the parts of the Iliad and the Odyssey, you have the image of a blind poet, a wandering minstrel, somebody who was roaming around from here, from this place to the other, and singing the stories of the Iliad and the Odyssey. It is thus that people believe that Homer himself must have been a blind poet. Yeah, so, but this is, these are the two works that we today attribute to Homer, written sometime during the 8th century. The Greeks of the 5th and the early 6th and the 5th centuries used the term Homer for the whole body of early heroic hexameter verse, which was written using hexameter, very long lines containing 12 feet, and which had a very lofty style about them. And they attributed all these lines of poetry to Homer. And some of the other works that were at that point of time thought to be his, like the epic cycle of poems, the Trojan cycle, then the Theban poems about Oedipus and other works, the Homeric hymns, and then also a comic mini epic known as Batrachomyomachia, the frog-mouse war. That was also believed to have been Homer's work. Anyway, now he is largely remembered as the author of the Iliad and the Odyssey. It is said that the Odyssey was probably a work that he wrote in a much older age than the Iliad. In any case, I think we are just the syllabus expects us to get introduced to the Iliad, the Odyssey, and the Aeneid. We are not expected to study them as epics, to know the entire story and then to be familiarized with the names of all the characters and so on, which would be a Herculean task. Again, that again is a term that was made popular by Homer himself. This these are huge epics. Both the Iliad and the Odyssey is written in something like 24 books. The Iliad was written and the Odyssey both had 24 books each. That's because of the number of the letters, the letters of the Greek alphabet, alpha to omega, 24 letters, one for each, and that is how he has divided, or that's how these works are divided into 24 books and running into thousands of lines. And the number of characters, the multiplicity of situations and events and characters both from the human and the divine world. It is a mind-boggling number, and it just would not be possible for us to study it in detail, but we need to have a rough idea about the language, the main characters, and particularly the features. Okay, so that is what we will discuss. We as people who are familiar with the Mahabharata and the Ramayana, both of these are the great epics that were written in India, composed in India, and the Mahabharata is any day, I guess, can be considered as a much greater epic than any other work written in the whole world because of the sheer size. The Mahabharata is much longer than both the Iliad and the Odyssey put together, and the number of characters also far exceeds the Iliad. You have the subplots and so on. So many Uba Kadagal, which each one of which is a kind of long epic in its own right. So nothing to match the complexity of the Mahabharata. But there is one thing that can be said for sure. You find a lot of similarities in the Mahabharata and the Iliad. We look at both the Iliad and the Odyssey. I'm sure you know that the background of these Greek epics is, of course, the Trojan War, the 10-year war that was fought between the entire Greek army and the tiny island of Troy. Troy, which was also known as Ilium. That is why it's known as the Battle of Ilium or the Iliad, the Song of Ilium, Iliad. That's how you get that term. So this was a mighty war, which brought to the foreground so many mighty warriors, all the great heroes that you can think of, whether it is Achilles, Agamemnon, then you have Odysseus or Ulysses. He was known as Ulysses in Roman mythology, Odysseus in Greek mythology. These mighty warriors, each belonging to different city-states of Greece, and they are in combat with the Trojans, led by people like Hector. So it's a clash of the great titans that you have there, in exactly the same manner that you have the clash of the mighty Pandavas and the Kauravas in the Mahabharata. And many of the characters, seem to have distinct similarities. Achilles can be said to be one of the mightiest of the warriors in the Greek epic, almost like Sri Krishna in the Mahabharata. In the Mahabharata, probably Arjuna may be considered as the great hero, but the role that Sri Krishna plays there as very, very, very central character is exactly parallel to the role of Achilles. And they have almost the same kind of background, the Achilles heel, exactly the same situation that Sri Krishna also had, the way in which the both of them meet their end and so on. A lot of parallels between the characters of Arjuna in the Mahabharata and Odysseus, in the Iliad and the Odyssey, the kind of adventures that they have, both of them reaching so many different lands, meeting many people with the great warriors that they were, and marrying so many times and so on. Again, a lot of similarities. It's probably because these were ages when you had people moving around, a lot of mingling, the Indo-European people. We talk about the Indo-European family of languages. So you have a lot of migration, in a world where you did not have strict borders between nations, naturally people would move from one region to the other, and a great deal of the stories would naturally get exchanged. In addition to that, you have the arrival of Emperor Alexander. You know, Alexander, during his reign, he reached India. His army, the Greek army, had even reached India, and probably they came with their stories. Some of our stories were taken there. So you have a lot of common features, you know, adding much color to both the epics. You cannot say that this story is better than the other. Each has its own glory, and we can only marvel at some of the similarities. You know, the similarities also probably come because of some of the common features of the epics. The epics were one of the early forms of grand literature in the oral tradition. Much before the other literary forms came, you have these oral songs. And there was a tendency in all those ancient civilizations to sing songs in order to make the people united, in order to churn up in them feelings of, you know, belonging to the particular clan or a particular region and so on. And with that intention in mind, they would compose these long narrative poems, largely centered around a central character of great stature, of heroic stature. That is what an epic is. A long narrative poem, typically one that is derived from an oral tradition and which narrates the deeds and adventures of a hero who is of legendary and great status, whose life influences not just his nation, but also sometimes the entire world. So that is what the epic is. And in each tradition, whether it is Indian, whether it is Greek, Roman, Sumerian, Babylonian, Akkadian, all those Egyptian, all the early civilizations had their own national epics. Right now, we are considering the Iliad and the Odyssey as national epics of Greece. And I have put up the names of some of the other major epics of the Western world. I have not put the names of Gilgamesh or Mahabharata and the Ramayana there, because we are now talking about the Western world. Virgil's Aeneid, the French Chanson de Roland, then you have the Italian one, the Spanish El Cid, Milton's Paradise Lost, Edmund Spenser's Fairy Queen. These are some of the major epics. I'll just conclude with some of the features of the epic, and then we'll continue in the next class. So an epic may deal with myths, histories, religions, religious tales, and so on. In any case, there will always be that central character. And the unifying feature, the unifying quality that epics fulfilled, I think, unifying need that epics fulfill, that is, I think, their greatest significance, belonging to that heroic age. To stir the spirit of warriors to heroic action by praising the exploits of their heroes. It was one of the favorite pastimes of the nobility in those times to gather and listen to these heroic songs. And they were also sung before a battle in order to inspire the people. The outstanding deeds of kings and warriors. And you also have a lot of archetypes being perpetrated by these myths, by these epics. So these are the, say, 7 main characteristics of the epic. The first is, of course, its length. It is long. It's no ordinary poem. It's very, very long. The hero is always a towering figure whose importance cannot be restricted to his nation alone. And the setting is always a large one, involves the destiny of many nations. It is spread over a large area. The action involves deeds of great valor, requiring superhuman strength and bravery. And you always have the supernatural playing a predominant part. It is not just restricted to human beings. The gods, angels, and demons also add to the immensity of the world of the epic. And it's always written in prose, not in verse, not in prose. And the poet tries to remain as an objective viewer, of the action. The poet's own voice or subjectivity is hidden, is not revealed. We also need to be familiar with some of the conventions of the epics. Okay. Um, which I guess I will do in the next class because it's almost time now. And yeah, it's a long list. So we'll begin with the epic conventions and see the way in which the Iliad and the Odyssey may be considered as epics, in what way they fulfill these conventions of the epic conventions. Okay. So I'll stop there for the moment. Let me stop the recording first and then I'll stop the